The rain fell relentlessly on the small, secluded town of Willowbrook, shrouding the landscape in a dismal gloom. Nestled deep within the dense forest was an old Victorian mansion, a place that had long been the subject of eerie whispers and unsettling tales. This was the residence of the Witherspoon family, and it was said to be cursed. Amelia Witherspoon, a middle-aged woman with a demeanor as somber as the weather, had recently lost her beloved grandmother Margaret. Margaret had been an enigmatic woman, known for her eccentricities and her obsession with dolls. Her collection was vast and unnerving, filling every corner of the Victorian mansion with lifeless eyes that seemed to follow you wherever you went. Margaret's will had been read in the dimly lit wood-paneled library. Her attorney, Mr. Blackwell, had announced that Amelia was to inherit her grandmother's estate, including the vast doll collection. It was a bequest Amelia had never wanted, for she had always harbored a deep aversion to the dolls. As the family gathered in the library, Amelia's husband, John, placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "You know, Amelia, we can sell the house and the dolls. We don't have to keep them." Amelia nodded, her eyes fixed on the ornate wooden box that held Margaret's last will and testament. She could feel the weight of her grandmother's legacy pressing down on her, suffocating her with a sense of dread. But little did she know, the sinister secrets of the doll collection were far from buried. That evening, as the family prepared to spend their first night in the mansion, the storm outside grew fiercer. Thunder rumbled like the growl of some unseen beast, and lightning cast eerie shadows on the walls. Amelia couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched as she walked past the countless dolls lining the shelves. John noticed her unease and tried to reassure her. "It's just an old house, Amelia. There's nothing to be afraid of." But Amelia knew better. She had heard the stories from her grandmother about the dolls coming to life at night, their porcelain faces contorting into malevolent expressions. Margaret had always laughed off these tales as fanciful stories to entertain her granddaughter, but the fear in her eyes had told a different story. That night, as the family settled into their beds, the dolls seemed to take on a more sinister aura. Their eyes glistened in the dim moonlight that filtered through the curtains, and their tiny mouths seemed to curve into malevolent grins. Unbeknownst to the family, the dolls had been waiting for this moment, for the return of a Witherspoon to the mansion. In the darkness, the dolls began to stir. One by one, they came to life, their joints creaking as they moved. They descended from their shelves, their footsteps barely audible on the old wooden floors. Each doll held a unique, chilling beauty, but it was the absence of humanity in their eyes that made them truly terrifying. The dolls moved with a purpose, converging on Amelia and John's bedroom. Their silent procession was like a macabre parade, and their intent was clear. They sought revenge for the family's neglect of them, for locking them away in the attic for generations. As the dolls reached the bedroom, they encircled the bed where Amelia and John slept. In unison, they raised their tiny, delicate hands and began to chant in a haunting, melodic chorus. The room grew colder, and the shadows deepened, as if the very air had grown heavy with malice. Amelia and John awoke to find themselves trapped, unable to move or speak. They could only watch in horror as the dolls continued their eerie incantation. It was a language of the long-forgotten, a dark and ancient tongue that sent shivers down their spines. With each chant, the dolls' voices grew louder, their eyes gleaming with a malevolent light. The room seemed to warp and shift, as if reality itself was bending to the will of the dolls. And then, with a final chilling crescendo, the dolls unleashed a wave of dark energy that enveloped Amelia and John. The morning sun struggled to penetrate the thick curtains of the Witherspoon mansion, casting long shadows across the room where Amelia and John had slept. As they slowly awoke from their uneasy slumber, they exchanged puzzled glances. "Amelia," John began, his voice trembling slightly, "I had the strangest dream last night." Amelia nodded, her heart still racing from the unsettling experience. "So did I, John. It was about the dolls. They were chanting something, and I couldn't move." John's eyes widened with surprise. "Amelia, I had the exact same dream. It felt so real." They sat in silence for a moment, both trying to make sense of the eerie coincidence. After a while, John suggested, "Maybe it's just the stress of inheriting this place, playing tricks on our minds. You know how stories about the dolls have always given us the creeps." Amelia reluctantly agreed, trying to dismiss the feeling of foreboding that still lingered. You're right, John. It's probably just our imagination running wild. However, as the day wore on, the unsettling presence of the dolls seemed to grow. They could hear faint, tiny footsteps in the distance, like the pitter-patter of raindrops on an old tin roof. But when they investigated, there was no one to be found. Their beloved cat, Mittens, was nowhere to be seen. The couple had assumed he had wandered off into the woods surrounding the mansion, as he often did. They called for him, but there was no response, just an eerie silence. As night descended once more, Amelia and John were startled by strange, dissonant whispers that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. The voices were indistinct, yet they filled the room with a sense of unease, like a congregation of lost souls mourning their fate. "Did you hear that, John?" Amelia whispered, her voice barely audible. John nodded, his face pale. "I did. It's probably just the old house settling, right?" Amelia desperately wanted to believe him, but the feeling of dread that had been gnawing at her since they arrived at the mansion had only intensified. She tried to reassure herself that it was all in their heads, but deep down, she knew that something was terribly wrong. In the darkness, the dolls continued to watch and wait. They had taken Mittens, not as a simple act of cruelty, but as a part of their sinister plan. In the attic, they had gathered around a makeshift altar, their porcelain hands stained with the blood of the innocent cat. As the night wore on, the dolls began to chant once more, their voices weaving a dark spell that would unleash unspeakable horrors upon the Witherspoon family. Mittens had been sacrificed to them, a grim offering in a ritual that would ensure their vengeance was exacted. Amelia and John, unaware of the gruesome events unfolding just above their heads, tried to sleep, clinging to the belief that their nightmares were nothing more than the product of their overactive imaginations. Little did they know that the dolls were not done with them, and their descent into darkness had only just begun. The sweltering heat inside the Witherspoon mansion had become unbearable. Amelia, unable to endure another night without air conditioning, decided to call for a repair technician. She dialed the number for the local HVAC company, her fingers trembling as she waited for someone to answer. A voice on the other end of the line finally said, "Willowbrook Air Conditioning. How can I help you?" Amelia took a deep breath and replied, "Yes, hello. Our air conditioning has gone out, and it's getting unbearably hot in here. Can you send someone to fix it?" The secretary on the line replied in a polite but detached tone, "Of course, ma'am. He should be there around 4. Amelia sighed with relief. "That would be great, thank you." As she hung up the phone, she turned to John and said, "Someone will be here around 4 to fix the AC." John, who had been fanning himself with a newspaper, groaned in frustration. "It can't come soon enough. This heat is driving me crazy." Amelia couldn't help but notice that John seemed different, more agitated than usual. She attributed it to the oppressive heat and decided not to dwell on it. When 4 p.m. finally arrived, the repair technician pulled up to the mansion in a battered van. John greeted him at the door, wiping sweat from his brow. "Thank goodness you're here," John said, leading the technician inside. "The AC is in the back of the house. Follow me." As they made their way through the mansion, John couldn't help but glance at the back of the technician's head. Whispers, like insidious tendrils, filled his mind, urging him to do something terrible. The voices implored him to grab a nearby wrench and bash in the technician's skull. John shook his head vigorously, trying to banish the horrifying thoughts from his mind. He couldn't understand where these dark impulses were coming from. It felt like something was twisting and warping his very soul. Arriving at the air conditioning unit, John showed the technician where the problem was. The technician set to work, his back to John, completely unaware of the turmoil raging within him. Meanwhile, in the room adjacent to the repair site, the dolls watched the technician with unblinking eyes. Sheila, the life-size baby doll, had been waiting for an opportunity to act. Her porcelain face, so innocent in appearance, belied the malevolence within. As the technician worked, Sheila silently reached for a nearby hammer, its cold metal glinting ominously in the dim light of the room. The other dolls seemed to encourage her with their eerie, silent approval. John suddenly realized he couldn't stay in the room any longer, the voices growing louder, more insistent. He mumbled an excuse to the technician and hastily left the area, not noticing the sinister turn of events unfolding behind him. With a swift and shocking motion, Sheila raised the hammer and brought it crashing down on the unsuspecting technician's head. The room filled with a sickening thud as the life was extinguished from the repairman. As the repairman lay unconscious in the room with the air conditioning unit, the tiny dolls converged upon him with eerie coordination. They moved with uncanny silence and astonishing speed, each of them carrying a piece of the technician's limp body. Amelia and John remained oblivious to the sinister activities taking place in the adjacent room. They sat in the parlor, hoping the AC repair would be completed soon, while the dolls continued their macabre operation. With the technician secured and still unconscious, the dolls dragged him up the narrow attic stairs, their tiny hands gripping his limbs. In the dimly lit attic, a dreadful transformation was underway. The dolls had transformed the space into a nightmarish tableau, like a scene from a twisted puppet show. The repairman's eyes fluttered open, and he groggily assessed his surroundings. He was bound and gagged, lying on the cold wooden floor of the attic. His heart pounded in his chest as he realized he was surrounded by hundreds of dolls, each one watching him with their lifeless eyes. Panic surged through him, but the gag prevented him from making any noise. He tried to free himself, struggling against his restraints, but the dolls were surprisingly strong, their tiny hands relentless in their hold. In the center of the attic, Sheila, the life-sized doll, stood with her back to the repairman. Her porcelain head seemed to be twisted unnaturally, facing away from him. He watched in sheer horror as her head slowly rotated to fixate on him, her lifeless stare sending shivers down his spine. Tears welled in the repairman's eyes as he desperately tried to scream, but the gag muffled any sound he could make. The dolls seemed to be going about their business, setting up a grotesque scene around him, as if preparing for a nightmarish ritual. Back in the parlor, Amelia and John exchanged worried glances. "It's been a while," John said, checking his watch. "He should have finished by now." Amelia nodded, her anxiety growing by the minute. "I'll go check on him." Amelia made her way to the back room where the technician had been working on the air conditioning unit. To her surprise, the room was empty, and there was no sign of the repairman. She glanced at the now operational AC unit and assumed that he must have completed his work and left without notifying them. Satisfied that the problem had been resolved, Amelia felt a sense of relief. She returned to the parlor where John was waiting and informed him, "It looks like the technician finished his job and left. The AC is working now." John nodded in agreement, grateful for the cooling relief. "Good, it's about time." This heat was unbearable. Unbeknownst to them, the repairman's absence was not due to his timely departure, but rather to a sinister plot unfolding in the attic above. The dolls had taken him, and the attic had been transformed into a nightmarish stage for their dark rituals. Amelia and John continued with their day, oblivious to the horrifying events taking place just above their heads. They went about their routines, each of them feeling a nagging sense of unease, but attributing it to the strange and unsettling stories they had heard about the dolls. John couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. He glanced out of the window and noticed that the repairman's van was still parked in front of the house. John turned to Amelia with a furrowed brow. "Amelia, I just realized that the repairman's van is still here. He couldn't have left without it." The couple ventured outside, the oppressive heat of the day replaced by the cool embrace of the evening. They approached the van, their footsteps echoing on the gravel driveway. John called out, "Hello? Is anyone in there?" but received no response. Amelia, growing increasingly concerned, peered through the van's windows. "There's no one inside, John." "This doesn't make sense." A sense of foreboding settled over them as they realized that the repairman had seemingly vanished into thin air. They decided to search the house, hoping to find some clue as to his whereabouts. Their search led them to the back room where the technician had been working. The AC unit was indeed functioning, but the room was empty, devoid of any sign of the repairman. Amelia's worry deepened. "John," she said with a tremor in her voice, "where could he have gone? He wouldn't just leave his van behind." John's brow furrowed as he scanned the room. "I don't know, Amelia, but something doesn't feel right." They continued their search, moving through the darkened mansion, their footsteps echoing through the empty halls. The feeling of unease that had been lingering all day now intensified, and a sense of dread settled upon them. As they ascended the grand staircase, John's voice quivered. "Amelia, did you hear that? It sounded like a whisper." Amelia strained her ears. but she couldn't discern any distinct words, only a faint, indistinct murmur in the air. I heard something too, John. It's as if the house is trying to tell us something. The Witherspoons continued their search, their anxiety mounting with each passing moment. Unbeknownst to them, the dolls watched their every move, their porcelain eyes gleaming in the dim light.